The morning sun was just breaking through the tall oak trees when Margaret pulled her silver sedan into the parking lot of Berkshire Music Academy. At 62, she still carried herself with the grace of someone who had spent decades on stage, though her hands now told a different story. The arthritis had been cruel, stealing away the very thing that had defined her life for so many years. She sat in her car for a moment, listening to the distant sound of scales and arpeggios drifting from the practice rooms. Today was the annual scholarship audition day, and Margaret had volunteered to be one of the judges. It was her way of staying connected to the music world that had once been everything to her. As she gathered her purse and the stack of evaluation forms, Margaret noticed an older gentleman in a navy blue security uniform, unlocking the main entrance doors. He moved with careful, deliberate steps, and there was something about the way he handled the keys that caught her attention. His movements were precise, almost musical. Walking toward the building, Margaret's heels clicked against the stone pathway. The security guard looked up and smiled warmly as she approached. "Good morning, ma'am. You're here early today," he said, holding the door open for her. His voice had a gentle quality that immediately put her at ease. "Thank you," Margaret replied, pausing at the threshold. "I'm Margaret Thornfield."
"I'm here for the scholarship auditions." "Ah, you're one of the judges then."
"I'm James Morrison. I've been the gatekeeper here for about 15 years now." He chuckled softly. "That's what the kids call me anyway. They say I'm the first test they have to pass before they even get to play." Margaret found herself smiling at his warmth. 15 years? You must have heard quite a lot of music in that time." James's eyes lit up. "Oh, you have no idea. Some days I feel like I'm living in a concert hall. The good, the bad, and everything in between. Though I have to say, the good far outweighs the bad most days." As they walked through the marble-floored lobby, Margaret noticed how James seemed to know every creak and whisper of the old building. He moved like someone who belonged there, not just someone who worked there. "Have you always worked in security?" Margaret asked, genuinely curious about this man who seemed so at home in a place dedicated to music. James was quiet for a moment, and Margaret worried she had overstepped. But then he spoke, his voice carrying a hint of something she couldn't quite identify. "Not always, no. I actually used to play piano myself back in the day." He gestured toward the grand piano visible through the glass doors of the main auditorium. "That was a long time ago, though, before life had other plans for me." Margaret stopped walking. "You played piano? Seriously?" "Oh yes, quite seriously, actually. I was even accepted to study at a conservatory when I was 18. James continued walking, but slower now, as if the memory was pulling him back in time. "But my father got sick that same year and someone needed to help support the family. My younger sister was still in high school, and my mother was already working 2 jobs. "So you gave up music?" Margaret's heart ached a little as she asked the question. She knew what it meant to lose music, though her circumstances had been very different. "Not gave up exactly," James said, pausing to adjust a notice board that had been hanging slightly crooked. "I told myself it was just temporary. I'd work for a few years, save some money, and then go back to my studies. But you know how life goes. One thing leads to another, and before you know it, 40 years have passed." Margaret found herself walking more slowly, drawn into this unexpected conversation. "Do you ever regret it?" James considered the question carefully. "Regret is a strong word. I have a good life. I was married to a wonderful woman for 35 years before she passed. We raised 2 kids who turned out to be decent people. I've had steady work and a roof over my head. But do I sometimes wonder what might have been? Sure, I think everyone does that." They had reached the main office where Margaret needed to check in for the day's auditions, but she found herself reluctant to end their conversation. "What kind of music did you play?" she asked, "Classical mostly." "I had a particular fondness for the romantic composers. Chopin, Liszt, Rachmaninoff. I used to spend hours working on those big dramatic pieces that make you feel like you're painting with sound." Margaret's eyebrows rose. Those were not easy composers, especially Rachmaninoff. His pieces were technically demanding and emotionally complex. "Those are challenging pieces," she said carefully. James nodded. "They were. But I loved the challenge. There's something about tackling a piece that seems impossible at first. You work at it day after day and slowly it starts to make sense under your fingers. Then one day it all comes together, and you realize you found something beautiful that was hiding in all those black dots on the page. The way he talked about music made Margaret's chest tighten with recognition. This wasn't someone who had just dabbled in piano as a hobby. This was someone who understood music in the same way she once had. "Do you still play at all?" she asked. James looked a bit embarrassed. "Well, I don't own a piano anymore. Sold it years ago when we needed the money for our daughter's college tuition. But sometimes," he glanced around to make sure no one else was listening, "sometimes I stay after my shift ends, and if one of the practice rooms is empty, I might sit down for a few minutes, just to remember what it feels like." Margaret felt a pang of recognition and sadness. Here was someone who had made the ultimate sacrifice, giving up his dreams for his family's welfare. And yet, after all these years, the music was still there, waiting patiently inside him. "The teachers don't mind?" she asked. "Most of them don't even know. I usually work the evening shift and I have keys to lock up. After everyone's gone home, the building gets quiet and sometimes I just can't help myself." James smiled sheepishly. "I know it might seem silly. A 67-year-old security guard sneaking around to play piano." "It doesn't seem silly at all," Margaret said firmly. "Music doesn't have an expiration date." James looked at her with surprise and gratitude. "Thank you for saying that. Most people think I should have moved on by now." As Margaret signed in at the office and prepared for the long day of auditions ahead, she found her mind returning to James and his story. There was something about his quiet dignity and the way his eyes had lit up when talking about music that stayed with her. She had no idea that by the end of this day, both their lives would be forever changed. Margaret settled into her chair in the main auditorium, her evaluation forms neatly arranged on the small table beside her. The other judges were already in position: Professor Williams from the piano department, Mrs. Chen, who taught violin, and Dr. Rodriguez from music theory. They all knew each other well from years of these audition days. The first student walked onto the stage, a nervous 17-year-old girl named Ashley who kept wiping her palms on her dress. She sat down at the grand piano and launched into a Chopin etude. It was technically proficient, but Margaret could sense the fear in every note. The girl was playing it safe, holding back the passion that should have been driving the music forward. "Thank you, dear," Professor Williams called out when Ashley finished. "We'll let you know our decision by Friday." The morning continued with a parade of talented young musicians. There was David, who played Beethoven with impressive precision but somehow made it sound mechanical. Then came Lisa, whose Debussy was beautiful but lacked the subtle color changes that made the composer's work truly magical. Each performance was good, some even very good, but Margaret found herself growing restless. During the lunch break, she stepped outside for some fresh air and found James sitting on a bench near the entrance, eating a sandwich from a brown paper bag. "How are the auditions going?" he asked, making room for her on the bench. Margaret sighed. "They're talented kids, really they are. But I keep feeling like they're all playing it safe. Where's the risk-taking? Where's the passion that makes you forget to breathe?" James nodded thoughtfully. "I hear them practicing all year long. Some of them are so worried about making mistakes that they forget to make music." "Exactly." Margaret turned to face him. "When I was their age, I would have rather crash and burn attempting something beautiful than play it perfectly safe." "What pieces are they working on this afternoon?" James asked. Professor Williams chose some really challenging material. There's a Rachmaninoff passage from his second piano concerto that's been giving everyone trouble. It's the part in the first movement where the piano and orchestra are practically fighting each other. All those rapid octaves and the melody weaving through like it's trying to escape. James's eyes sparked with recognition. "Ah, that section. It's around measure 102, right? Where it feels like your hands are trying to have two different conversations at once." Margaret stared at him. "You know that piece? I mean, really know it?" "I spent about 3 months working on just that passage when I was 19. Nearly drove my teacher crazy because I kept insisting I could master it if I just practiced it enough." James chuckled. "I was stubborn back then." "And did you? Master it, I mean." James was quiet for a moment, then smiled. "Eventually, though I'm not sure my neighbors appreciated all those hours of repetition." The afternoon auditions began with even more challenging pieces, and Margaret watched as student after student wrestled with the difficult Rachmaninoff passage she had mentioned to James. The first attempt came from Kevin, a promising senior who had been preparing for months. He started confidently enough, but when he reached the treacherous section, his left hand stumbled over the rapid octaves. He tried to recover, but the damage was done. The magic was broken. "Don't stop," Professor Williams encouraged. "Push through it." Kevin finished the piece, but Margaret could see the disappointment in his shoulders as he walked off stage. Next came Rachel, whose technique was generally stronger. She approached the difficult passage with determination, but the rapid-fire notes got away from her too. Her timing fell apart, and what should have been a thrilling musical dialogue turned into a musical argument where nobody was listening. By the fourth failed attempt, Margaret was gripping her pen so tightly her knuckles had turned white. These were good students, some of them exceptional, but they were all making the same mistake. They were so focused on the notes that they were missing the emotion underneath. "This is painful to watch," she whispered to Professor Williams during a brief pause. "It's a notoriously difficult passage," he replied. "Even professional pianists sometimes struggle with it." "But it doesn't have to be this hard," Margaret said, her frustration building. "They're approaching it like it's a technical exercise instead of a piece of music that's trying to tell them something." James had been standing quietly near the back of the auditorium, staying out of the way but close enough to hear the performances. Margaret noticed him there during the break between students, and an idea began forming in her mind. When the next student, Benjamin, also stumbled through the same passage, Margaret found herself speaking louder than she intended. "These kids make it look impossible," she said to no one in particular. "It's like they've never heard how it's supposed to sound." Professor Williams looked at her with concern. "Margaret, are you all right?" She stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. "I'm sorry, but this is frustrating. That passage isn't just a bunch of notes to be conquered. It's Rachmaninoff pouring his heart out onto the page. It's supposed to feel inevitable, like water flowing downhill." The other judges exchanged glances. Margaret was known for her passion, but this level of agitation was unusual for her. "Maybe we should take another short break," Mrs. Chen suggested gently. But Margaret was on a roll now. "You know what? If I could still play, I'd show them exactly how that passage should sound. But since I can't..." She turned toward the back of the auditorium where James was standing. "If I can play a single note anymore, I'll offer $10,000 to anyone who can play that passage the way it was meant to be played." A murmur went through the small group of students who were waiting their turn. $10,000 was serious money to a college student. "Margaret, perhaps we should discuss this privately," Professor Williams said, clearly concerned about where this was heading. "No, I'm serious," Margaret replied, her voice carrying across the auditorium. $10,000 to anyone who can play that Rachmaninoff passage with real understanding, not just technical accuracy. James had moved closer during her outburst, and now he was standing just a few rows back from the judge's table. When Margaret's eyes met his, she saw something there that made her pause. "You know that passage, don't you?" she said to him directly. The entire auditorium seemed to hold its breath. Students turned to look at the security guard in his simple uniform, standing among all these serious musicians and music students. James looked uncomfortable with all the attention. Well, yes, I know it. I mentioned earlier that I used to work on it years ago." "How well do you know it?" Margaret pressed. Professor Williams tried to interrupt. "Margaret, I think we should get back to the scheduled auditions." But Margaret wasn't backing down. "I'm serious about the money. $10,000 cash to anyone who can play that passage with real musical understanding. Anyone at all." The challenge hung in the air like a musical note waiting to resolve. Students whispered among themselves, some already mentally spending the money, others calculating whether they should risk public humiliation for such a reward. But James just stood there quietly, his hands at his sides, watching Margaret with an expression she couldn't quite read. Something was stirring behind his calm exterior, though. Something that had been sleeping for a very long time was beginning to wake up. The auditorium buzzed with excitement after Margaret's bold challenge. $10,000 was more money than most of these students had ever seen at once. Within minutes, word had spread throughout the entire academy. Students who had already auditioned came back to watch. Others who weren't even scheduled to perform that day showed up, hoping to try their luck. Professor Williams pulled Margaret aside during the commotion. "Are you sure about this? $10,000 is a significant amount of money." Margaret nodded firmly. "I've never been more sure about anything. These young people need to understand that music isn't just about hitting the right notes at the right time. It's about connecting with something deeper." The first volunteer was Tyler, a sophomore who had been practicing piano for 12 years. He was known around the academy for his technical skills and had won several regional competitions. As he sat down at the piano, the auditorium fell silent. Tyler began the passage with confidence, his fingers moving quickly across the keys. The rapid octaves in the left hand were clean and precise, but as the melody entered in the right hand, something was missing. The notes were all correct, the timing was nearly perfect, but it sounded like a very talented computer playing rather than a human being expressing something meaningful. When he finished, there was polite applause, but Margaret shook her head sadly. "Beautiful technique, Tyler. Really impressive. But I need to feel something when you play that passage. Right now it sounds like you're reading me the phone book very eloquently." Tyler looked disappointed but took it well. "I understand. Thank you for the chance." Next came Andrea, a graduate student who specialized in romantic period composers. She had a different approach, focusing more on the emotional content of the piece. Her playing was expressive and heartfelt. But when she reached the technically demanding section, her fingers couldn't keep up with her musical intentions. The rapid passages became muddy, and the beautiful melody got lost in the confusion. "I can hear what you're trying to say," Margaret told her gently. "Your heart is in the right place. But this particular passage demands both technical mastery and emotional understanding working together perfectly." One by one, brave students stepped forward to try. Some had the technical skills but missed the emotional connection. Others understood the music's meaning, but couldn't execute the difficult passages cleanly. A few came close, managing to combine both elements for brief moments before something fell apart. As the afternoon wore on, Margaret began to wonder if her challenge was unfair. Maybe she was asking for something that only came with years of professional experience. Maybe these students, talented as they were, simply hadn't lived enough life yet to understand what Rachmaninoff was really trying to communicate. James had remained in the auditorium throughout the afternoon, watching each attempt with quiet attention. Margaret noticed that he never seemed surprised when someone struggled with a particular section. It was as if he could predict exactly where each student would run into trouble. During a break between attempts, she walked over to where he was standing. "You've been watching very intently," she observed. James nodded. "It's fascinating to see how different people approach the same piece of music. Everyone brings their own perspective to it. You seem to know exactly where they're going to have problems before they get there." "Well, I've heard that passage attempted many times over the years, and I remember my own struggles with it very clearly." James paused, then added quietly, "I still struggle with it, actually." Margaret's eyebrows rose. "Still? You mean you still practice it?" James looked around to make sure no one else was listening, then lowered his voice. "I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but yes, I've been using the practice rooms here after hours for the past few years. Not every night, but a couple times a week when I can manage it." "James, that's wonderful. Why shouldn't you tell me that?" "Because I'm just the security guard. This place is for real musicians, people with talent and training and futures in music. I'm just an old man who gave up his chances long ago." Margaret felt a surge of emotion at his words. "That's complete nonsense. Music doesn't belong only to people with fancy degrees or professional careers. If you love it and you're working at it, then you're a real musician." James smiled sadly. "That's kind of you to say. But I think we both know there's a big difference between sneaking around to play piano in empty practice rooms and being good enough to actually perform for people." "How often do you practice?" Margaret asked. "Usually Tuesday and Thursday nights after my shift ends at 11. Sometimes Saturdays if there are no events scheduled. I have keys to the building so I can lock up when I'm finished." "And you've been working on the Rachmaninoff?" James nodded. "Among other pieces, yes. It's one of those pieces that never really leaves your system once it gets in there. I've been chipping away at it for about 2 years now, trying to get it right." Margaret studied his face carefully. There was something in his expression, a mixture of longing and resignation that told her more than his words did. "James, can I ask you something honestly?" "Of course." "When you practice that Rachmaninoff passage in those quiet practice rooms late at night with no one around to judge you or compare you to anyone else, how does it sound?" James was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Sometimes on the good nights, it sounds like something I remember from a long time ago. Something I thought I'd lost forever." Margaret felt her heart skip a beat. "Would you be willing to try it?" "Here now for the challenge." James looked shocked. "Oh no, I couldn't. This is for the students, for real musicians. You're just what? Someone who's been practicing that exact piece for 2 years? Someone who clearly understands it better than anyone else who's tried today? But I'm 67 years old. I haven't performed for anyone in decades. I'd probably freeze up completely. Margaret stepped closer to him. James, let me ask you something. If you don't try, how will you feel tomorrow morning? Or next week? Or 10 years from now? James stared at the grand piano on the stage. Margaret could see the internal battle playing out on his face. Fear and hope were wrestling with each other, and she wasn't sure which one would win. The money isn't really what this is about, is it? He asked finally. No, it's not. The money is just my way of making sure people take it seriously. What this is really about is whether music is alive or dead, whether it's something precious that connects us to our deepest selves, or just an academic exercise that we perform to impress other people. James took a deep breath. If I try and fail, everyone will see. All these talented young people, all the professors. They'll see that I'm just a foolish old man who should have stayed in his place. And if you succeed? James looked at her with eyes that held 40 years of buried dreams. I don't know. I honestly don't know what happens if I succeed. Margaret waited, saying nothing. This had to be his decision, made for his own reasons. Finally, James nodded slowly. Would your offer really apply to me? Even though I'm not a student here? My offer applies to anyone who can play that passage the way it deserves to be played. Anyone at all. James squared his shoulders and looked toward the stage. Then I'd like to try. Word spread through the academy like wildfire. The security guard was going to attempt the $10,000 challenge. Students who had gone home for the day rushed back. Faculty members appeared in doorways. Even the kitchen staff found reasons to linger near the auditorium entrance. James stood at the back of the room, his hands trembling slightly as he watched more and more people file in. What had seemed like a private moment of courage now felt like stepping into a spotlight he had spent 40 years avoiding. I don't know if I can do this with all these people watching, he whispered to Margaret. She placed a gentle hand on his arm. James, every single person in this room has felt exactly what you're feeling right now. Fear is just excitement wearing a disguise. The music is still there inside you, whether there are 10 people listening or 100. Professor Williams approached them, looking concerned. James, you don't have to do this. There's no shame in changing your mind. Actually, there is, James replied quietly. If I walk away now, I'll be ashamed of myself for the rest of my life. He began walking toward the stage, his security uniform making him stand out among all the young people in their concert attire. Each step felt like it took tremendous effort, as if he were walking through deep water. His heart was beating so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. When he reached the piano bench, James paused and looked out at the audience. There were at least 50 people now, maybe more. Students sat in the front rows, their faces curious and expectant. Faculty members lined the walls. Margaret was in her original judge's seat, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. James sat down slowly and adjusted the bench. The piano was a beautiful Steinway Grand, probably worth more than he made in 3 years. He placed his hands on his knees and took 3 deep breaths, just like his old teacher had taught him to do before performing. I haven't played for an audience in over 40 years, he said to the room. If this goes badly, please remember that I'm primarily a security guard these days, not a pianist. A few people chuckled nervously, but most remained silent, sensing that they were about to witness something significant. James lifted his hands and placed them gently on the keys. He started with a simple C major scale, just to get his fingers warmed up and to remember how this particular piano responded. The notes rang out clear and true. The instrument was perfectly tuned and had a gorgeous, rich tone. Then he began the Rachmaninoff passage. The opening notes were tentative at first, as if he were asking the piano's permission to play. But as the melody developed, something extraordinary began to happen. James's shoulders relaxed. His breathing became more natural. The nervousness that had been radiating from him just moments before seemed to melt away. When he reached the technically difficult section that had defeated so many students throughout the day, something magical occurred. His left hand launched into the rapid octaves with a confidence and precision that made several students gasp audibly. But it wasn't just the technical accuracy that was remarkable. It was the way he made those racing notes seem inevitable, like they couldn't possibly be played any other way. Meanwhile, His right hand was weaving the melody through the octaves with a subtlety and expressiveness that took everyone by surprise. This wasn't just someone who had memorized the notes. This was someone who understood what Rachmaninoff had been feeling when he wrote this music. The passage that had sounded like a frantic race when the students played it now sounded like a conversation between old friends. The left hand wasn't fighting the right hand. They were supporting each other, creating something beautiful together. The rapid sections flowed like water, while the melodic lines soared above them with a warmth and richness that filled the entire auditorium. James's entire body was involved in the music now. He swayed slightly with the phrases, his shoulders moving with the dynamics. His face, which had been tight with worry just minutes before, was now completely relaxed and focused. He looked like a man who had come home after a very long journey. As the passage built toward its climax, James's playing became even more confident. The difficult runs that had tripped up student after student flowed from his fingers effortlessly. But more than that, he was making musical choices that showed a deep understanding of the composer's intentions. He lingered slightly on certain notes to bring out inner voices that most people never even noticed. He shaped phrases with a maturity that could only come from someone who had lived enough life to understand what the music was really about. The students in the audience were exchanging amazed glances. This wasn't what any of them had expected. Tyler, who had been the first to attempt the challenge, was shaking his head in wonder. "He's not just playing it," he whispered to the person next to him. "He's living it." Professor Williams was staring with his mouth slightly open. In 30 years of teaching, he had heard this passage played by hundreds of students, by visiting artists, by recording artists. But he had never heard it played with quite this combination of technical mastery and emotional truth. Margaret felt tears streaming down her cheeks. This was exactly what she had been hoping to hear all day. This was music that was alive, music that meant something, music that connected the performer to something larger than himself. As James approached the final section of the passage, he seemed to grow even more confident. His hands moved across the keys with a fluidity that made the difficult music look almost easy. The concluding phrase, which should have felt like an ending, instead felt like a doorway opening to something beautiful. When the last note faded into silence, the auditorium remained completely quiet for several long seconds. James sat with his hands still positioned over the keys, as if he couldn't quite believe what had just happened. The silence stretched on, and for a moment he began to worry that his performance had been terrible. Then someone started clapping. It was Margaret standing up from her seat, applauding with tears still visible on her cheeks. Within seconds, the entire auditorium erupted in applause. Students were on their feet, faculty members were nodding appreciatively, and several people were wiping their eyes. James looked up at the audience in shock. The applause continued for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only about 30 seconds. When it finally died down, he stood up from the bench on unsteady legs. Was that acceptable?" he asked Margaret. Professor Williams stepped forward. "Acceptable? James, that was extraordinary. In all my years of teaching, I've rarely heard that passage played with such understanding." Margaret walked up to the stage, reaching into her purse for her checkbook. "You did something today that I wasn't sure was possible. You proved that music is still alive, that it still matters, that it can still move people." She began writing out the check for $10,000, but as she did, she realized that the money was the least important part of what had just happened. Something much more valuable had taken place in this auditorium today. James was still standing by the piano looking dazed. "I can't believe I actually did that," he said softly. "Believe it," Margaret replied, handing him the check. "And more importantly, don't you dare go back to thinking of yourself as just a security guard. You're a musician, James. You always have been." The check felt strange in James's hands. $10,000 was more money than he typically saw in 6 months of paychecks. But as he stood there holding it, surrounded by people who were still buzzing with excitement from his performance, he realized the money wasn't the most important thing that had happened today. "James, can we talk privately for a few minutes?" Margaret asked as the crowd began to disperse. They walked to a quiet corner of the lobby away from the students who were still discussing what they had just witnessed. James could hear fragments of their conversations as they passed. "Did you know he could play like that?" one student was asking another. "I've walked past him 1,000 times and never had any idea," came the reply. Margaret waited until they were alone before speaking. "That was the most beautiful performance I've heard in years. Not just technically perfect, but emotionally true. Do you realize what you just did? James shook his head slowly. Honestly, no. I feel like I'm in some kind of dream. 3 hours ago, I was just the security guard who opens doors and checks ID cards. Now everyone's looking at me like I'm someone completely different. That's because you are someone completely different. Or rather, you've always been this person, but you've been hiding it from the world, and maybe from yourself too. James looked down at the check again. What am I supposed to do with this? Margaret smiled. That's entirely up to you. But I hope you'll consider letting me help you do more than just cash it and put it in the bank. What do you mean? I mean, I'd like to offer you something else. Something that might be worth more than $10,000 in the long run. Margaret paused, choosing her words carefully. How would you feel about teaching? James blinked in surprise. Teaching? I'm not qualified to teach. I don't have a degree in music. I don't have certifications or credentials. You have something better than credentials. You have understanding. You have the ability to connect with music in a way that moves people, and based on what I just witnessed, you have the technical skills to back it up. Professor Williams approached them, having overheard part of their conversation. Margaret's right, James. What you demonstrated today isn't something that can be taught in a classroom. It comes from years of dedication and a deep love for the music itself. But I'm 67 years old, James protested. Who's going to want to learn from someone my age who spent the last 15 years working security? Anyone who heard you play today, Professor Williams replied firmly. James, I've been teaching here for 30 years. I know talent when I hear it. More importantly, I know wisdom when I hear it. What you brought to that Rachmaninoff wasn't just skill. It was life experience, patience, and a kind of musical maturity that can't be rushed. Margaret nodded enthusiastically. Exactly. And I'm thinking we could start small. Maybe a few private students to begin with. People who are looking for something more than just technical instruction. I don't understand. Are you offering me a job? I'm offering you a chance to become who you were always meant to be, Margaret said softly. Look, I have some connections in the music world. I could help you get started with a few students who would appreciate your approach. And in the meantime, if you're interested, I'd be honored to sponsor your return to formal musical study. James felt dizzy. Sponsor my studies? But I'm too old for that. Says who? Music doesn't have an age limit. If you want to work toward a degree, or just take some advanced classes or study with a master teacher, I'd be happy to cover the costs. Consider it an investment in something beautiful. The next few weeks passed in a blur for James. Word of his performance had spread throughout the local music community faster than he could have imagined. A local newspaper ran a story about the security guard who won a $10,000 challenge with a stunning piano performance. The story was picked up by other papers, and soon his phone was ringing with calls from people he'd never met. The first call came from Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman whose granddaughter had been struggling with piano lessons. I heard about what you did, she said. My granddaughter has all the technical ability in the world, but she plays like she's afraid of the music. Could you maybe work with her? That first lesson was terrifying for James. He met 12-year-old Sophie and her grandmother at the academy, using one of the practice rooms after hours. Sophie played a Chopin waltz perfectly, hitting every note with precise timing. But just like the college students at the audition, something was missing. That was very accurate, James told her when she finished. But can I ask you something? What do you think Chopin was feeling when he wrote that waltz? Sophie looked puzzled. I don't know. Happy, I guess. It's in a major key. James sat down at the piano. Let me play just the first few measures, and I want you to close your eyes and tell me what pictures come into your mind. He played the opening phrase, but not the way Sophie had played it. He added tiny hesitations in certain places, subtle changes in volume that brought out different voices in the music. When he finished, Sophie's eyes were wide. It sounded like someone remembering something beautiful that made them sad at the same time. Exactly, James said. Music can hold two feelings at once, just like people can. Now try playing those same measures, but think about that feeling you just described. When Sophie played it again, the notes were the same, but something had changed. There was a warmth and depth that hadn't been there before. Oh, she whispered. Oh, I think I understand. That lesson led to another and then another. Soon James had 5 students, then 10. Margaret helped him set up a small studio in a converted room at the academy, and Professor Williams officially hired him as an adjunct instructor. 6 months after that life-changing audition day, James stood in the same auditorium where everything had begun. But this time he wasn't wearing a security uniform. He was dressed in a simple black suit, preparing to give his first public recital in over 4 decades. The auditorium was packed. His students were there, along with their families. Margaret sat in the front row, beaming with pride. Professor Williams and other faculty members filled the middle section. But what touched James most was seeing some of his former security colleagues in the back rows, there to support him as he walked onto the stage. James thought about all the mornings he had unlocked these doors, never imagining that one day he would be walking through them as a performer rather than just an employee. Life had a funny way of bringing you back to where you belonged, sometimes taking the longest possible route to get you there. He sat down at the piano and looked out at the audience. "A year ago, I thought my story with music was over," he said. "Tonight, I'm learning that sometimes the most beautiful chapter begins when you think the book has already ended." The first piece he played was the Rachmaninoff passage that had changed everything. But tonight it sounded even more beautiful than it had that day. It sounded like coming home.